In the heart of Louisiana, where the moss hangs heavy and the air itself seems haunted by secrets, lies a plantation whose beauty masked something unspeakable. Oak Alley, a place of grandeur and despair, where candlelight flickered over polished wood and screams echoed through the fields at night. Beneath its sweeping oaks and columns of white marble, history remembers only whispers. But the soil remembers the truth. What happened there in 1851 was so depraved, so monstrous, that even the river refused to carry the stories downstream. Tonight we uncover them. The year was 1851, and the Oak Alley Plantation stood like a jewel in the crown of Louisiana's Old South, its white columns gleaming under the thick humidity, its path shaded by ancient oaks whose roots seemed to writhe like veins beneath the earth. To those who passed along the river, it was a place of wealth and refinement, a house of manners and music, a home where laughter drifted across verandas and the clinking of glasses filled the twilight. But that was only what the world was meant to see. Beneath its elegant facade, beneath the perfume of magnolias and the grace of its hostess, something darker thrived. The plantation was not built on soil, but on secrets, on blood, on a hunger that could not be spoken aloud. The slaves who worked the fields whispered that Oak Alley was cursed, that every brick of the grand house was soaked in sorrow, that no prayer spoken there was ever heard by God. The master of Oak Alley, Charles de la Roche, was a man of wealth and stature. His name carried weight across the parishes. His family had been part of Louisiana's aristocracy since the early days of French settlement, and he saw himself as the embodiment of civility and divine right. His charm was practiced, his smile rehearsed, and his reputation spotless. Guests often admired his intellect, his knowledge of medicine and anatomy, his fascination with life and the human body. But those closest to him knew that his curiosity was not the kind that built hospitals or healed the sick. It was a curiosity that festered, one that devoured him from within and twisted his mind into something unholy. He believed that beneath the skin of man and woman lay the truth of the soul, that through the act of suffering one could glimpse purity. The slaves who served him did not understand his words, but they felt his meaning every time he looked at them with that cold, calculating gaze. He would walk among them in the early morning hours, long before the overseers began their work, selecting those who had caught his attention for reasons none dared to question. Some said he was looking for beauty. Others whispered that he was searching for a flaw, a mark of corruption that only he could see. Those chosen would not return the same. Some returned with eyes empty as hollow wells, their voices gone, their spirits broken beyond repair. Others did not return at all. At night, the house changed. The laughter from dinner faded, and the chandeliers dimmed until only candlelight remained. The servants were ordered to their quarters, and the hallways filled with the faint sound of footsteps, the creak of doors opening and closing, the muffled cries that echoed through the floorboards. The slaves knew to cover their ears and pray, but even the prayers seemed to turn to ash on their tongues. The mistress of the house, Celeste de la Roche, was known for her beauty and grace, yet her eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much. She said little, smiled less, and often stood by the window long into the night, her reflection faint in the glass, as if she too was trapped between worlds. Some said she knew everything, that her silence was her only defense. Others claimed she was as lost to the madness as her husband, her mind eroded by the same rot that had taken root in the walls of the house. Charles de la Roche's study was a place few dared enter. Behind its locked door, he kept books imported from Europe, volumes on anatomy, theology, and forbidden sciences. The air inside smelled of spirits and iron, the scent of blood disguised by cologne and candle wax. He wrote obsessively in journals, pages filled with diagrams of the human form, words written in both French and Latin, and sketches that blurred the line between art and desecration. His obsession grew with each passing month, his experiments more frequent, his demeanor more detached. Those who worked closest to him said his eyes had changed, that he no longer saw people but vessels, instruments for whatever twisted truth he sought to uncover. The slaves began to vanish without explanation. One by one, their names were whispered at night, followed by silence. A young girl named Amara, barely 17, was taken after she spilled wine at dinner. A man named Jonah disappeared after collapsing in the field. Their quarters grew emptier, the whispers more fearful. Some tried to flee, but the swamps swallowed them, their bodies found days later torn apart by the elements or never found at all. The overseers said it was punishment for disobedience, but those who had lived long enough on the plantation knew that it was something else. They said the master was feeding the house, that each soul taken was bound to its walls, that the oak trees themselves had begun to thirst. Guests still visited, oblivious to the terror beneath their feet. They admired the beauty of the home, the warmth of the hosts, the way the sunset turned the columns gold. They dined in the great hall, where portraits watched from the walls, eyes too lifelike, almost knowing. But even they would notice the strange chill that lingered after dark, the faint rustle from the upper floors, the feeling that something unseen was watching from the shadows. A few whispered of odd sounds in the night, of glimpses of figures moving where none should be, of servants whose eyes darted toward the forbidden wing of the house. The beauty of Oak Alley became its own disguise, its elegance a mask over decay. Those who worked there knew that daylight was only a reprieve, that once the sun sank behind the trees, the house awakened to its true nature. The wind through the oaks would carry the faint sound of weeping, and the ground seemed to pulse like a living thing. They said the roots of the great trees reached deep into the soil where bones were buried, where the unspoken sins of the master and his bloodline were hidden away. Each night the plantation seemed to breathe, slow and heavy, as if it hungered for what daylight denied it. The house itself became a living thing, feeding on fear, growing stronger with every secret buried beneath its marble floors. The secret rituals of Oak Alley were spoken of only in whispers, traded like curses between trembling lips when the moon was high and the air was still. Behind the closed doors of that grand house, there existed a world unseen by visitors, a labyrinth of rooms forbidden to all but the master himself. The second floor, where the corridors turned dark and narrow, hid the truth that no one dared acknowledge. There was one room in particular, locked by an iron key that never left Charles Delaroche's possession. It was said to be an attic chamber, though the slaves called it the White Room, for the walls were painted a pristine color that mocked the suffering inside. At night, faint light would leak from beneath its door, a trembling glow that flickered like a dying candle. From outside, one could hear sounds that did not belong in any home, muffled cries, the scraping of metal, a voice murmuring prayers that twisted into something unrecognizable. Charles told his guests that the room was his place of study, where he pursued medical research, but the slaves knew better. They had seen the ones who entered and did not return. The air near that part of the house was heavy, thick with the scent of iron and something sour, something that clung to the skin like oil. It was said that when the door opened, even for a breath of a second, a strange stillness would fall over the hallway, as if time itself paused to listen. Those unfortunate enough to clean near it in the day found marks on the floor, long dark stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove, patterns that seemed to form symbols when viewed under the faint morning light. No one spoke openly of what occurred behind that locked door, but the plantation carried its memory like a scar. Some of the older slaves said it began with the master's obsession with sin and salvation. Charles Delaroche was not merely a man of wealth, but of warped faith. He believed that human desire was both curse and gift, that the body's suffering could lead to purity. He read passages from forbidden texts and claimed that pain was a doorway to divine truth. The line between scripture and sacrilege blurred until they became one and the same. His servants were forced to assist him, silent witnesses to acts that turned their stomachs and haunted their sleep. There were nights when he summoned a group of them to carry lanterns and stand at the threshold of the attic, ordered never to look up, never to speak. They heard his voice reciting verses, the sound of chains dragging, the sudden gasps that filled the air. Sometimes he would sing in a low hum that made their blood run cold. When it was over, they were told to clean what remained: torn fabric, shattered glass, the faint traces of crimson that smeared the floorboards. The walls of that room were said to breathe, to exhale sorrow like a living creature. Those who lingered too long near it would claim they could hear whispers behind the plaster, voices that spoke their names softly, pleading to be released. The mistress of the house avoided the upper floors altogether. Celeste Delaroche's beauty had once been the pride of the region, but by 1851 it had faded into something ghostly. Her skin grew pale, her eyes distant, her mind trapped in a fog of denial and fear. She would wander the verandas at dawn, muttering prayers to saints long forgotten, clutching a rosary so tightly the beads cut into her palm. Some said she once tried to stop her husband, begging him to destroy the instruments he used, but he silenced her with words that broke her spirit. She lived as a shadow thereafter, a silent figure drifting through rooms that were no longer her own. The staff knew that the attic was not the only place where horrors took root. Beneath the chapel, where Mass was occasionally held to preserve the illusion of sanctity, there was a hidden cellar accessible through a trap door behind the altar. The master called it his room of cleansing. It was there that he performed what he called purification rituals on the enslaved, ceremonies that mimicked baptism, but defiled every sacred meaning it once held. Witnesses later whispered that he would mix holy water with blood, that he marked the foreheads of his victims with ash and oil while murmuring about rebirth. The screams that rose from beneath the chapel were mistaken by visitors for the howling of the wind, but those who worked the grounds knew they came from the living, not the spirits of the dead. As his madness deepened, Charles began to keep meticulous records of his actions. He wrote in coded language, convinced that his discoveries would one day be recognized as divine revelation. The journals described the body as a vessel for truth, that through the exorcism of desire one could glimpse the purity of creation. Each page bore smudges of ink and fingerprints that looked darker than ink should ever be. He believed he was not committing sin but transcending it, rising above mortal restraint. The slaves, however, saw only the growing emptiness in his eyes, the way he stared at them as if already dissecting their souls. The housekeepers and field hands began to notice strange changes in the environment. Birds avoided the trees near the main house, their songs ceasing whenever the attic light flickered. The hounds used to guard the grounds refused to go near the steps at night, their fur standing on end, their eyes fixed on something unseen. Even the children of the slaves, who knew little of fear, began to wake crying, saying they saw a woman in white standing by the trees, her mouth sewn shut, her eyes weeping blood. The adults would hush them, but they too felt the presence, a coldness that never left no matter how warm the night became. Despite the terror that hung in the air, life on the plantation continued outwardly as usual. Cotton was harvested, guests entertained, and sermons given. But behind every polite smile was a trembling silence. Everyone knew that something was festering in the heart of Oak Alley, something that fed on submission and secrecy. They said the house demanded obedience and repaid it with madness. Those who served were bound by fear, and those who ruled were consumed by their own corruption. The rituals grew bolder, the cries louder, until even the walls seemed to echo with suffering that refused to die. The chapel of Oak Alley stood slightly apart from the main house, framed by willows that drooped like mourners and surrounded by gravestones whose names had been swallowed by time. By daylight it seemed a place of solace, its whitewashed walls and stained glass windows glowing softly in the sun. But those who lived and worked on the plantation knew that when darkness fell, the chapel became something else entirely. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a stage for desecration, a place where the master's pursuit of divine truth took its most horrifying form. The candles that burned there at night did not illuminate holiness but sin dressed in sacred robes. The same altar that had once seen prayers now bore the weight of suffering disguised as salvation. Charles Delaroche's obsession with redemption had reached its peak. He had convinced himself that human lust was the original sin, that only by purging the body of desire through pain could one reclaim purity. He twisted scripture to suit his delusions, quoting verses in a trembling voice while his hands performed acts too monstrous for heaven to forgive. The slaves chosen for these rituals were told they were to be cleansed, prepared to be reborn in the eyes of God. They were taken from their quarters at night by the overseer, their wrists bound, their eyes covered. Some believed they were being punished for their sins. Others prayed that death would find them before sunrise. Inside the chapel, the air was heavy with incense and blood. The pews had been removed to make space for what Charles called the table of renewal, a large slab of wood polished smooth from use. It was there he enacted his twisted ceremonies. He would appear dressed in a white robe, embroidered with gold thread, his face lit by candlelight, his eyes fever bright. He carried with him a Bible and a scalpel, both symbols of his self-appointed divinity. Those who assisted him were forbidden to speak. They watched as he whispered prayers, his voice quivering with devotion and madness alike. He claimed to see angels guiding his hands, claimed to feel the breath of God upon his neck as he tore away the humanity of those before him. The women chosen for these rites were often young, strong, and healthy. He would begin by making them confess their sins, forcing them to repeat words he placed in their mouths. Then came the rituals that mocked baptism. Water poured over their faces until they gasped for breath. Oil smeared across their foreheads mixed with something darker that no one dared to name. He called it the anointment of the spirit, but the smell of it made the stomach twist. The prayers grew louder as the night deepened, blending with screams that echoed through the trees. Those outside pretended not to hear, pressing their hands to their ears and murmuring their own desperate pleas to a god they no longer trusted. The master kept meticulous notes on each ritual, writing down the reactions of his victims as though they were experiments rather than human beings. He spoke of them as vessels, instruments of divine revelation, their pain a pathway to enlightenment. He believed that by merging physical agony with spiritual devotion, he could create beings untouched by sin, souls purified through the destruction of the flesh. The results of his madness were buried before dawn, their names erased, their graves unmarked. Yet some nights the earth near the chapel seemed to stir, as if the dead refused to rest. Celeste Delaroche's role in these atrocities was uncertain. Some said she had become complicit, numbed by years of fear, forced into silence by threats and humiliation. Others claimed she wandered the halls at night whispering the names of the lost, her mind unraveling under the weight of what she could not change. There were rumors that she once entered the chapel during one of her husband's rituals and fainted at the sight before her. After that night, she rarely left her room, her body frail, her voice barely a whisper. The servants said she prayed constantly, but never to the same God her husband worshipped. The enslaved people spoke of the chapel as if it were alive. They said it breathed, that its walls pulsed with the heartbeat of those who had perished within. When the wind blew through the trees, it carried the faint sound of chanting, the same twisted hymns the master had once sung. During storms, lightning would strike unnaturally close to the building, illuminating the stained glass with the color of fresh blood. The slaves refused to go near it, even in daylight, claiming that anyone who entered alone would lose their mind before sunset. There was one man, an older slave named Samuel, who claimed to have seen what went on inside. He had been forced to clean the chapel one morning after a night of ritual. He spoke of the smell first, something foul and metallic, something that clung to his skin no matter how much he washed. He said the walls were streaked with handprints, that the candles had burned down to blackened nubs, and that on the altar lay a book filled with writing so frenzied it looked more like scratching than script. He said he heard a voice whisper his name, though he was alone, and that when he looked toward the window he saw a figure standing outside, a woman draped in white, her face hidden by shadow, watching him. He never went near the chapel again. The rituals grew more erratic as time passed. Charles began performing them more frequently, sometimes multiple nights in a row. He stopped sleeping, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling from whatever fever gripped his mind. He claimed he was close to discovering the divine essence that separated man from beast. He began using symbols drawn in blood across the chapel floor, markings that resembled neither Christian crosses nor any scripture known to the slaves. The lines seemed to move when the candlelight flickered, forming shapes that filled the onlookers with dread. It was around this time that people began to speak of apparitions on the plantation. Guests reported seeing figures gliding across the veranda, their forms flickering like shadows cast by unseen flames. Workers spoke of hearing faint singing from the fields, songs that stopped the moment they turned to listen. Children woke screaming, claiming to see faces staring at them from the windows. The overseers dismissed it as superstition, but even they began to carry charms and crosses for protection. The house and its chapel had become a single organism of terror, feeding off the fear of everyone trapped within its reach. Each ritual seemed to leave a mark not just on those who endured it, but on the very air. The plantation's nights grew heavier, its silence thicker. The soil near the chapel darkened, the grass refused to grow, and the air always smelled faintly of decay. It was as if the land itself was trying to purge what had been done to it, but the weight of the sins was too great to lift. The silence that had once wrapped Oak Alley in false serenity began to crack, revealing the rot that had long been festering beneath its polished veneer. The grand plantation that had once stood as a monument to Southern grace was now a house that breathed sickness and decay. Its walls seemed to tremble with secrets, its floors creaked under invisible footsteps, and its mirrors reflected things that should not have existed. The slaves who had survived the master's rituals moved through the grounds like ghosts themselves, their eyes hollow, their spirits drained. Even the overseers, once cruel and unflinching, began to whisper that the house was cursed. The nights grew longer, the air thicker, and something unseen seemed to watch from every corner. The master's mind had begun to unravel completely. Charles Delaroche no longer distinguished between the living and the dead, nor between prayer and profanity. He would speak to the walls as though they were his disciples, his voice echoing through empty corridors, calling names no one recognized. Servants who passed by his study would hear laughter one moment and sobbing the next. His journal entries became unreadable scrawls, written in a mix of Latin, French, and symbols that no scholar could decipher. He often locked himself in his chambers for days, refusing food or company, claiming that the souls he had purified were speaking to him, guiding him toward divine revelation. But those who dared peek through the keyhole saw only a man collapsing under the weight of his own madness, surrounded by candles that burned even when there was no wind to stir them. Celeste Delaroche moved like a phantom through the halls. Her once beautiful face had grown pale and thin, her eyes lifeless, her hands trembling as if she carried some invisible burden. She rarely spoke now, and when she did, her words made little sense. Some nights, she wandered barefoot into the fields, whispering to the darkness, her white nightgown glowing faintly under the moonlight. The slaves who saw her said she called the names of the women who had vanished, her voice cracked and trembling, as though she were trying to summon them back. On other nights, she would stand in front of the chapel, motionless for hours, staring at the door as if waiting for someone to come out. The housemaids whispered that she was no longer human, that her soul had already fled, leaving only a shell behind. The servants began to disappear again, though this time not taken by the master for his rituals. Some vanished while fetching water from the well, others while tending to the fields. Their tools would be found lying where they had been working, but the workers themselves were gone without a trace. The slaves spoke of hearing voices calling to them from the woods, familiar voices that lured them toward the trees. Those who resisted said they saw figures between the oaks, women in white, their faces blurred, their hands outstretched as if begging to be freed. One worker who escaped the forest returned raving, his hair turned white overnight, his body trembling as though seized by fever. He said the trees whispered the names of the dead and that something beneath the ground was moving. Even the land itself began to revolt. The once lush gardens withered, the roses turned black, and the grass refused to grow. The river that ran past the plantation grew murky and still, as though thickened by something unseen. Animals began to flee the area. The horses grew wild-eyed and refused to approach the stables. The dogs howled endlessly through the night. When storms came, lightning struck the house more than once, but it never caught fire. It was as if the place refused to die. The slaves said that God had turned his face away, that Oak Alley belonged to the devil now, that it would stand until every sin committed within its walls was paid for in blood. Charles became increasingly violent. He accused his servants of conspiring against him, claiming that they were possessed by the spirits of the ones he had purified. He would drag them into his study, demanding they confess, forcing them to kneel as he read passages from his journals. His voice would rise and fall, trembling with manic energy, his eyes wild and unfocused. Sometimes he would strike them, other times he would weep and embrace them as though they were his children. The line between cruelty and pity had vanished entirely. The house staff began to hide from him, locking their doors at night, whispering prayers through their tears. The nights were no longer still. Strange sounds echoed through the halls, soft footsteps when no one was there, the faint clinking of chains, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The mirrors were the worst. They began to cloud over with a dark film, as if smoke lingered on their surface. Those who dared to look too long claimed to see faces staring back, faces they recognized, faces that should have been buried. The mistress ordered the mirrors covered with black cloth, but even then their reflections seemed to bleed through, faint outlines shimmering like ghosts trapped in glass. The slaves who worked the field said that the house bled. When it rained, red water trickled from the cracks between the floorboards, pooling in the corners before vanishing into the earth. No one dared to touch it. Some nights the candles would light themselves, their flames flickering even when there was no breeze. The scent of iron filled the air, mingled with the smell of decay. The slaves said the spirits of the tortured were clawing their way back into the world, that they would not rest until the master's name was erased from memory. Even the master began to fear his own creation. He stopped entering the chapel, claiming that voices within accused him, that hands unseen tugged at his robe when he tried to pray. He boarded up its doors, but at night the candles inside still burned. The windows glowed faintly, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard like fingers reaching for the house. He took to sleeping in his study, surrounded by books and symbols he believed would protect him. But nothing could shield him from what he had awakened. He began to see figures in his reflection, women with hollow eyes, mouths open in silent screams, children standing at the edge of his bed. He would wake, gasping, drenched in sweat, calling for servants who no longer came. The decay spread to the very bones of the plantation. The walls sweated with dampness, plaster crumbling in corners, wooden beams rotting from within. Guests stopped visiting, rumors spreading that Oak Alley was haunted by those who had died unjustly. The few who came out of curiosity left pale and shaken, swearing they had seen shadows moving independently of light, that they had heard sobbing when no one was near. The house that once represented wealth and refinement had become a mausoleum, every room heavy with the weight of suffering. The oaks that lined the path to the river seemed to lean closer now, their branches twisting like arms, their roots digging deep into the graves that fed them. The night of reckoning came without warning, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary of watching the sins of Oak Alley go unpunished. The air was thick and restless, the sky swollen with black clouds that blotted out the moon. The slaves felt it before it began, a trembling in the earth, a heaviness in the chest that made it hard to breathe. The animals grew frantic, horses kicking at their stalls, dogs whining and clawing at the doors. Even the wind carried a strange sound, a low moan that seemed to come from the depths of the bayou. The house stood unnaturally still, its windows dark except for the faint flicker of light coming from the master's study. Inside, Charles Delaroche sat surrounded by his books, his candles burning low, his mind consumed by the voices that had never left him. He believed that this was the night he would ascend, the night when his divine revelation would be complete. But the revelation that awaited him was not of heaven. In the quarters, whispers spread among the slaves that the time had come. For weeks, they had seen the signs, blood seeping from the chapel walls, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, the reflection of the dead in every mirror. Some said they had dreamed of their ancestors, their faces painted in ash, telling them that deliverance was near. Others claimed the ghosts of those who had perished within the master's rituals had returned to guide them. Fear and rage mixed like poison in their hearts until it became something else, something stronger than despair. Under the cover of thunder, they gathered near the edge of the fields, their eyes fixed on the house that had consumed their lives. The plan was simple and desperate: to destroy it, to erase its evil from the earth, even if it meant perishing in the fire themselves. Inside, the mistress sat in her room, rocking back and forth, her rosary clutched tight in her hands. She could hear the storm outside, the thunder rolling like the sound of drums. The voices in the walls were louder tonight, whispering her name, calling her to the window. When she looked out, she saw figures moving through the rain, shadows carrying torches, their faces lit by the glow of defiance. For a moment, she felt a strange calm, as though the weight of years had lifted from her chest. She whispered a prayer that was neither for her husband nor for herself, but for the souls that had suffered in silence. Somewhere deep within the house, a door slammed open, and the sound of shattering glass followed. The reckoning had begun. The first flames appeared near the chapel. The oil that had soaked the wooden floors for years caught quickly, sending ribbons of fire crawling up the walls like living serpents. The stained glass burst inward from the heat, scattering shards that reflected the infernal light. Smoke poured from the windows, thick and black, carrying the smell of burning incense and flesh. The slaves moved swiftly, some breaking into the house, others surrounding it to prevent escape. The rain began to fall in heavy sheets, but it did nothing to smother the flames. The fire seemed to feed on something deeper than wood and oil, something that had been waiting for release. Charles Delaroche stumbled from his study, coughing, his eyes wild with terror. The voices that had once whispered divine secrets now screamed in his ears. He shouted prayers into the smoke, calling upon angels to save him, but his words were drowned by the crackling of fire and the rising chorus of screams. He tried to flee down the hallway, but the floorboards buckled beneath his feet, glowing red with heat. Faces appeared in the smoke, faces of those he had destroyed, their mouths open in silent accusation. He reached for the staircase, but the railing turned to ash in his hand. The house groaned like a wounded beast, its walls splitting, its timbers shrieking as they burned. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos below. The enslaved shouted, not in fear but in fury, their chants swallowed by the roar of the storm. The air was alive with the mingling of fire and rain, the smell of earth and death. Some tried to rescue the mistress, believing her as much a victim as they were. They found her in her room, still kneeling, her eyes turned toward heaven. She did not resist when they lifted her, though she whispered that it was too late, that the house would never let them go. As they carried her toward the door, the ceiling above cracked open, releasing a torrent of fire that engulfed the room. The plantation burned for hours. Flames climbed the oaks, licking their branches until they glowed like torches in the night. The great columns of the mansion collapsed one by one, the roof caving in with a sound that echoed across the fields. The sky turned red, and the bayou reflected the inferno, its waters shimmering like molten glass. Those who survived swore they saw figures dancing within the flames. Men and women, their bodies wreathed in fire, moving as though freed from pain. Some said they heard singing, low and mournful, rising above the crackle of burning wood. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the house was nothing but smouldering ruins. The air was thick with ash and the smell of charred wood. The oaks that had once lined the path stood blackened, their leaves turned to cinders. The ground was soaked not just with rain, but with blood. The slaves who had survived gathered in silence, their faces streaked with soot and tears. They had destroyed the monster that had ruled their lives, but in doing so, they had become witnesses to something far older and darker. Some believed that the spirits of the dead had finally been set free, while others said the fire had only awakened what slept beneath. Days later, travelers passing along the river claimed to see smoke rising from the ruins, even though the fire had long been out. They spoke of strange sounds at night, the creak of floorboards where no floor remained, the faint laughter of a woman, the echo of chains dragging across stone. Those who dared to walk near the property said the air grew colder the closer they came, and that sometimes, when the wind moved through the charred oaks, it carried the sound of weeping. The bayou, once clear, turned dark and sluggish, as though thickened by secrets. The ground itself seemed to pulse when touched, as if it still breathed. In time, the land was left to ruin. The new owners who tried to rebuild found their workers refusing to stay past dusk. They said the walls bled when touched, that footprints appeared in the dust, though no one had walked there. Some nights, a light could be seen flickering among the trees, pale and distant, like a candle carried by unseen hands. The legend of Oak Alley grew, passed from one generation to the next, each telling darker than the last. Those who listened said the house had never truly burned away, that its spirit lingered beneath the soil, waiting for someone foolish enough to awaken it again.